This is lecture 135B on the far north of North America, part 2, and our subject today is the northeastern woodlands cultural area. And this, of course, is in support of the forthcoming volume 8, which is the last volume in this series of the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism. When this comes out, it will be Bolshevism 2019. At any rate, this cultural area stretches from the northeastern coast of the USA and the Canadian Maritimes to west of the Great Lakes. The deciduous forests of southern Ontario are where it begins, and the St. Lawrence lowlands and the coastal maritime provinces phase northward into the mixed deciduous coniferous canopy of the Canadian Shield in the west and the Appalachian uplands in the east. The Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed provided access to water transportation to all its peoples except those of the maritime provinces. The northeastern woodlands people include the Iroquois, Micmac, Ojibwe, and Wendat. Their land covers southern Ontario and the coastal Atlantic province of Canada. Their upper lithic stage broad-spectrum wild resource exploitation of hunting, gathering, and fishing evolved into the northeastern woodland archaic and formative stages to include autochthonous horticulture, and then with the arrival of corns and beans to true agriculture. The Iroquoian people referred to corn, beans, and squash as the Three Sisters. Men cleared the forest, and women were responsible for planting. Animism and animatism characterized their ideology, as in the case of all primitive communist peoples. Eastern woodlands indigenous peoples belong to two unrelated language families, Iroquoian and Algonquin. The Iroquois people form part of the Iroquoian language group, but not its entirety, and the same is true for the Algonquin and the Algonquin language group. Iroquoian-speaking peoples include the Erie, south of Lake Erie, the Neutral, that is Grand River to Niagara River area, the Wenrow, east of the Niagara River, Haudenosaunee, or Six Nations, including the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora. Wendat Huron, the St. Lawrence River Valley in the 1500s, and Wind Lake Huronia in the 1600s. The latter stretched from Georgian Bay to Lake Ontario. And Iroquois includes the Petun, south and southwest of Georgian Bay, and the St. Lawrence Iroquoians from what is present-day Montreal to Quebec City. Algonquin-speaking peoples in the eastern woodlands include the Ojibwe in eastern Lake Superior to northeastern Georgian Bay, Odawa, Manitoulin Island, and Bruce Peninsula, Nipissing in the Lake Nipissing area, Algonquin, Ottawa River and tributaries, the Abenaki from present-day Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, New Brunswick, and southeastern Quebec. The Wollastockik Massit in the St. John River in western New Brunswick, northeastern Maine to Quebec, and the Micmac in the Gaspé Peninsula and what is now New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. Iroquoian-speaking peoples in the northeastern woodlands generally occupied much of what is now southern Ontario, northern Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, and the St. Lawrence Valley as far east as the present-day Quebec City area. Algonquin-speaking groups extended from Lake Superior north of Lake Huron to the Ottawa Valley and east through present-day New England and the Maritime provinces. Now, with regard to the mode of production beginning with technology, the prehistoric Stone Age economy of the northeastern woodlands featured broad-spectrum wild resource hunting, gathering, and fishing for lithic and archaic stage Algonquin peoples. They hunted deer, bear, moose, and caribou, and where available, seals, porpoises, and whales. In hunting, they used bows and arrows, lances, traps, snares, and deadfalls. For fishing, they used hooks, weirs, nets, and lysters. A lyster is a spear used for fishing that has 3 prongs with backward-facing barbs. Now, primitive communists used a saw knife to carve bone and ivory prongs and barbs. Meat was either boiled or roasted for immediate consumption or smoke-dried for future use. In the Great Lakes area, Algonquin peoples also collected maple and birch sap in the early spring. Among the Algonquin peoples, there was an autochthonous horticultural cultivation of wild rice that characterized the formative stage. Odawa, Algonquin, Micmac, and Abenaki peoples planted additional crops. When corn arrived, its farming was important to the Wolastoqiyik economy. The Ojibwe relied on wild rice harvested in the late summer and may have been responsible for its spread outside the lands of its origin. The Nipissing cultivated corn. When that was insufficient, they traded fish and furs for Wendat corn. Iroquoian-speaking peoples followed the same pattern of cultural evolution from broad-spectrum wild resource exploitation in the lithic and archaic stages. White-tailed deer were one of the most important game animals, except in the north, where moose were preferred. Some coastal peoples hunted seals as well as freshwater fish, eels, mollusks, and crustaceans. Waterfowl and land birds were seasonally important in some areas. For animals, especially beaver, were significant in interchiefdom trade. Peoples in the area gathered and ate a variety of berries, nuts, tubers, and plants, and some groups harvested maple and birch sap. In the formative stage, they moved from experimentation with local cultigens to corn after its arrival. Thereafter, they relied primarily on cultivated corns, beans, and squash. Fishing, hunting, and gathering continued to supplement these domestic crops. Men cleared forests, and women planted and harvested the crops. Wigwams used by the northeastern woodlands hunters were covered with birch bark, skins, or mats. Crop storage among the Iroquoian peoples was a feature of permanent sedentary life, as were fenced-in settlements ranging from small hamlets with a few families to towns where as many as 2,000 persons lived. Population density was high among the Wendat. Although estimates vary, there may have been from 70,000 to 90,000 northern Iroquoians at the time of white contact. A typical village contained a large number of elm or cedar bark long houses. Now, seasonal activities among the Algonquins featured an abundance of certain food, especially fish. With the advent of horticulture, seasonality in obtaining a living ended. Nevertheless, dwellings were smaller and less permanent than among the Iroquoians. The homes varied from conical birch bark teepees to domed wigwams or rectangular structures that housed several families. Village size varied seasonally, with the largest population concentrations occurring in summer. The Iroquoians traveled mainly on land or in elm bark or birch bark canoes. The Algonquins made similar birch bark canoes. The Micmac used caribou skin canoes. In building a canoe, bark was stripped from the birch, placed inside a staked frame, sewn and attached. Ribs are fixed in position and seams sealed with spruce gum. In the winter, the Iroquoians used snowshoes, sleds, and toboggans. The long, narrow snowshoes and bare paw snowshoes of the northeastern woodland hunters were used for different snow conditions. Babiche was used as lacework for snowshoes. Babiche is rawhide formed into strips for making fastenings, animal snares, and snowshoes. Trade and visiting appear to have been common activities among neighboring Algonquin peoples. They also traded with Iroquoian peoples, importing corn and fish nets from the Wendat, for example. Clothing for the northeastern woodlands indigenous peoples was made of animal skins and furs. The men hunted animals for hides, and women tanned the skins. Women created the clothing and decorated it with beads, quills, and a variety of natural products. Typical clothing for the people of the northeastern woodlands included robes, breechcloths, leggings, and skirts. For footwear, people wore moccasins made of animal hide. The mode of production social organization. Before white contact, the largest political unit among most northeastern woodlands Algonquin peoples was the band. A tribal village consisted of several bands. By formative stage time, tribal villages had become simple chiefdoms. Patrilineal groups designated by an animal totem was characteristic of northeastern woodlands Algonquin peoples. Village band territories were loosely defined. All simple chiefdom members had access to basic subsistence resources. In Iroquoian society, long houses sheltered several matrilineal-related families. One or more households formed a matrilineage. Several lineages composed an exogamous clan, where individuals married outside. A particular totem emblem designated each clan. Residence in these households was matrilocal, so there was a constant flow of men from one moiety into the wife's longhouse. Personal property inheritance followed the female line. Clanmates among the Haudenosaunee, regardless of village or community affiliation, considered themselves siblings. Among some groups, clans were united into moieties. Phratries were composed of 3 to 10 clans whose members were scattered in several villages. Eventually, the simple chiefdom, Iroquois, and level peoples evolved into advanced theocratic chiefdoms, or ATCs, that possessed both civil chiefs and war chiefs, reflecting the specialization of administrative and military activities. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy had a council of about 50 permanent and hereditary offices. Condolence ceremonies commemorated deceased Confederacy chiefs, bestowing upon their successors the honorary names associated with the office, and the Wendat had a similar political system. Intricate beadwork and quillwork is one feature of northeastern Woodlands art. Women used feathers, porcupine quills, shells, dyes, and similar items to adorn their families' clothing, moccasins, and belongings. Iroquoian peoples often decorated clan symbols on their longhouses. Northeastern Woodlands peoples created wampum, tubular purple, and white beads made from shells used for ornamental, ceremonial, diplomatic, and commercial purposes. Beadwork was sometimes more than decorative. It could hold political meaning. In some treaties, wampum belts featured the major tenets of the agreement. To accept wampum belts in formal council meant agreement with the stipulations in its woven design. The belt thereafter served to perpetuate the treaty. In northeastern Woodlands cultures, art expressed on the body included tattooing of the face and body of both men and women. These tattoos symbolized a person's lineage and clan identity. An art form of the Haudenosaunee was the False Faces Society wooden masks with metal eyes, and horsehair was added by men for use in curing ceremonies. Iroquoian languages have 2 branches, a southern one composed of Cherokee and a northern branch that includes the Erie, Neutral, Wenro, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Petun, and St. Lawrence Iroquoians. The languages of the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, the Wendat, Petun, and Neutral, are all extinct. The 6 Iroquoian languages spoken in Canada today, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and Tuscarora, moved with their people from New York State after the success of the U.S. Revolutionary War. Within the northeastern Woodlands, there are 2 branches of the Algonquin family, Central Algonquin, that is Ojibwe, Odawa, Nipissing, and Algonquin, and Eastern Algonquin, that is Abenaki, Micmac, and Maliseet. Now, as to ideology, the Haudenosaunee had a number of medicine societies focused on healing, the best known being the False Face Society. For their ceremonies, members wore elaborately carved wooden masks. The Haudenosaunee also practiced the Longhouse religion, a blend of ancient indigenous traditions and innovations introduced by the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake. Algonquin peoples practiced Midewiwin, Grand Medicine Society. Once widespread, the Midewiwin became less prevalent after the arrival of Europeans in the 1700s. Today, the largest Midewiwin societies are found in parts of Ontario, Manitoba, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. Indigenous peoples in the northeastern Woodlands, being primitive communists, relied upon part-time specialists called shamans to interpret their animism and animatism. Among Algonquins, shamans performed rites to ward off evil spirits, such as the Wendigo, and assisted in locating game, as did shamans in Iroquoian communities for the benefit of their people. Northeastern Woodlands peoples and their shamans engaged in healing practices and in seasonal rituals associated with crop harvests and periodic feasts. The Wendat held elaborate feasts of the dead, usually at the time when villages were moving to new locations. The bones of dead relatives were gathered and placed in mass graves with personal items. Algonquin peoples also held feasts of the dead, although they were not identical to those of the Wendat. During the AD 1600s, these feasts attracted large number of peoples, often from several nations. Vision quests associated with the acquisition of a personal supernatural guardian were common among the northeastern Woodlands cultures. Young boys would venture alone into the wilderness with no food or water and wait for a spirit guide to reveal to them great knowledge. In some nations, such as the Odawa and the Menominee, young girls participated. Once the adolescent performed the quest, they returned to their village and as enlightened adults. Now, white contact. European contact brought about considerable culture change among all the northeastern woodlands groups. Hunting, gathering, and fishing became marginal, although fishing remained a significant source of income. Then their agricultural practices declined as whites forced them into restricted areas. The first of these whites were Scandinavians and North Germans, who made sporadic visits to the Arctic and eastern seaboard between AD 900s and 1300s. In AD 1500, fishermen of the Newfoundland Grand Banks started trading for furs just before Jacques Cartier's contacts with the Micmac and St. Lawrence Iroquoians in AD 1534 to 1535. During the late 1500s, the fur trade expanded to involve, either directly or indirectly, most northeastern woodlands peoples. During this period, the St. Lawrence Iroquoians disappeared from their homelands and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy gained prominence. By the early 1600s, there had been European settlements on Sable Island and Tadoussac on St. Croix Island in present-day Maine and at Port Royal in the Annapolis Valley. In 1609, Henry Hudson explored the coast of what became New England. The Hudson River is named after him. Samuel de Champlain accompanied an Algonquin, Innu, and Wendat war party against the Mohawk near Lake Champlain, an event that marked the beginning of European participation in intertribal hostilities that lasted for another century. By 1626, when the Dutch established New Amsterdam, that is New York City, intensive trade had largely exterminated fur-bearing animals along the Atlantic coast. During the first half of the 1600s, epidemics brought on by European diseases, as well as warfare, drastically reduced indigenous populations. And meanwhile, new trade relationships with Europeans disrupted the subsistence cycles of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. A variety of trade items replaced indigenous equivalents, resulting in dependency relationships and new forms of territoriality and leadership. In the Great Lakes area, the Haudenosaunee intensified their attack on other Iroquoian-speaking peoples and Algonquin groups during the 1640s and 1650s, forcing many to flee their homelands. Remnant groups of Wendat and Petun peoples fled west and became known as the Wyandot. One group settled at Loretteville near Quebec City, becoming the Huron-Wendat. The Haudenosaunee, their population reduced by warfare and disease, replenished numbers by adopting war captives and refugees. In New England, the Pequot War of 1636 to 1637 and King Philip's War 1675 to 1676 decimated the indigenous population and effectively removed their ability to oppose European settlement. After 1675, some Abenaki people moved to St. Francis near the St. Lawrence. By 1690, Haudenosaunee power was in flux. Ojibwe and Algonquin peoples moved into present-day southern Ontario. Their descendants continue to occupy reserves there today. In 1722, the Haudenosaunee accepted the Tuscarora, a northern Iroquoian-speaking people who had fled from what is now North Carolina, into their confederacy, and following this addition, the confederacy became known as the Six Nations. Throughout the first half of the 1700s, most Algonquin-speaking peoples of the northeastern woodlands were allied with the French and traded furs in exchange for European commodities, except for a group of Mohawk who had settled near Montreal. The majority of the Haudenosaunee were allied with the British. Now, with regard to indigenous British relations, 1763 to 1867, after the French and Indian War, from 1754 to 1763, that Winston Churchill calls the First World War because so much of it was fought in India, New France fell to the British. Then a loose coalition of nations, including the Odawa and Ojibwe, became disaffected because of the new regime's policies. These included the appropriation of land, the crushing of any opposition by force, and the end of symbolic gift exchanges. In 1763, Odawa chief Owandiyang, known as Pontiac in English, led his group of Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and some Wyandot to lay siege to Fort Detroit. His allies captured Fort Michilimackinac, and war raged throughout the region, but the alliance quickly faltered. Pontiac agreed to peace in 1766. The incident, known as Pontiacs War, demonstrated indigenous peoples' continued struggle for autonomy and influenced the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which recognized indigenous territorial rights and laid the foundation for future treaty negotiations. In practice, the proclamation did not apply to maritime colonies, and therefore the colonial administrators in these areas felt empowered to seize lands and establish reserves without treaty negotiations. Most Algonquin peoples were allied with the British during the North American Revolutionary War of 1775 to 1781. However, the struggle split the loyalties of the Haudenosaunee in New York State. Many of them subsequently moved to lands granted to them by the British in what is now southern Ontario. Members of all the 6 nations in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy settled along the Grand River. Some Mohawks settled at the Bay of Quinte. Land cessions, a growing economy dependency on European colonists, and general demoralization stimulated a revitalization movement in 1799 that was led by the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake. The new Longhouse religion spread to other Haudenosaunee communities in the United States and Canada. Handsome Lake and Pontiac were the early leaders of indigenous self-determination in the Pan-Indian movement. After the War of 1812, some Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi moved from the United States to the Georgian Bay area. Another portion, including the Oneida, settled on the Thames River. During the first half of the 1800s, the colonial government established reserves for Algonquin-speaking peoples around Georgian Bay. The Robinson-Huron and Robinson-Superior treaties of 1850 secured large tracts of land north of Lakes Superior and Huron for the government. In the Atlantic provinces, the colonial government, not bound by the terms of the Royal Proclamation, established some 60 Micmac communities. And that brings us to the Northern Plains cultural area. The Northern Plains cultural area has a climate characterized by hot and dry summers and freezing winters. Rivers cut across the plains, providing water to the area. The growth of trees in the area is restricted to the valleys. The mode of production of the Northern Plains cultural area relied on seasonal fruits and vegetables, including nuts, berries, corn, and on the immense herds of buffalo that roamed the grassland. The languages spoken in the Northern Plains belong to the Blackfoot, Plains, Cree, and Ojibwa. The intermarriage between the locals and the European settlers led to the rise of the Métis. And the Northern Plains and prairies of Western Canada, like no other region of North America, provided an environment in which the Upper Lithic descendants continued their way of life with relatively little alteration until the time of European contact. As the large herbivores of the Ice Age became extinct in the early post-glacial period, these people transferred their pursuit to the various species of now extinct bison that occupied the grasslands. Although heavily dependent on bison, they were hunters of smaller game and gatherers of plant foods. They developed communal hunting, involving ambush and the driving of bison, to hunters armed with spears and darts thrown with throwing boards called atlatls. Archaeology knows these people primarily through the chipped flint spearheads that they used. Now, there are new hunting methods. By about 9000 BP, their fluted projectile points had been replaced by lanceolate or stemmed varieties characteristic of the late Plano tradition. Between approximately 9,000 and 7,000 years ago, the Plano people developed a widespread and apparently efficient bison hunting adaptation across the northern plains. By at least 7,000 BP, caribou hunters using spear points obviously related to those of the Plano tradition had pushed northward to the barren lands between Great Bear Lake and Hudson Bay. The following 2 millennia on the northern plains, between approximately 7,000 and 5,000 BP, feature the climax of the post-glacial warm altithermal when heat and drought reduced the carrying capacity of the grasslands. Thus, fewer bison and fewer bison hunters occupied the area. Nevertheless, sites around the fringes of the plains and some sites in the plains area show continuing occupation and the development of spear points with notches for hafting. Such points are characteristic of the Middle Prehistoric period, 5,000 to 2,000 years BP. Then, various groups used more efficient communal bison hunting techniques, including jumps, over which the bison were driven. Now, technology from outside. The past 2,000 years saw the introduction to the plains of various influences from the eastern woodlands and from the Mississippi and Missouri Valley peoples to the south. During the early first millennium AD, small chipstone arrow points began to replace the spear points of earlier times, and the introduction of the bow must have increased hunting efficiency. Pottery, cooking vessels, and containers of types similar to those in use to the east and south were used. Burial mounds were constructed in some regions, especially in southern Manitoba's Linear Mounds archaeological site, and exotic trade goods indicate contacts with the farming people of the Missouri Valley. Although most of the northern plains were beyond the limit of prehistoric agriculture, relatively small-scale farming was attempted in the more southerly regions. And then horses arrived on the plains. The westward push of European settlement in the 1700s caused a rapid acceleration of change in prehistoric plains life, as tribes from the northeastern woodlands began to move westward into the grasslands. Horses, which had gradually spread northward from the Spanish settlements in the U.S. Southwest, reached the Canadian plains about AD 1730, causing a revolution in Aboriginal techniques of hunting, traveling, and warfare. For the next 150 years, until the disappearance of the bison in the late 1800s, the Canadian plains and prairies saw the development of a way of life that must have been dramatically richer and more nomadic and more varied than that of the earlier occupants of the area. There is a recent occasional paper, number 4, of the Canadian Archaeological Association entitled Archaeology on the Edge, New Perspectives from the Northern Plains, 2004, edited by Brian Kuhlman and Jane Kelly, University of Calgary Press. And it is the best recent set of papers bringing the archaeology of this far northern region up to date. The volume is dedicated to Richard G. Forbes, who was my doctoral committee chairman and a real gentleman of the old school variety. And that brings us to a conclusion of this, next to the last of the lectures on North America proper, and then I'm going to do a lecture summarizing, revisiting Volume 1, so that we can tie all 8 volumes together. And that'll take care of it for today.